There are places where power is absolute, where rules aren't just enforced, they are lived by. Places where even the smallest act of defiance can have consequences. And for those who break the rules, the price can be steep. Inside John B. Connolly Unit, a high-security prison in Texas, discipline was everything. Every movement was controlled. Every interaction was watched. It was a world of order and obedience on the surface. For Angela Simmons, the warden, control wasn't just part of her job. It was who she was. Years of experience had shaped her into a leader who commanded respect. To outsiders, she was the backbone of the facility, a woman who had climbed the ranks through hard work and discipline. Her job required her to be tough, to make difficult decisions, to never let emotions interfere with duty. But what happens when a person who enforces the rules breaks them? Few people knew Darius Monroe before he became inmate number 482913. He wasn't the most dangerous man in the prison, but he wasn't to be underestimated either. He had been convicted of aggravated assault and had spent years behind bars, learning how to survive, how to read people, how to gain influence in a place where influence meant everything. Some inmates fought for power with violence. Others used intimidation. But Darius? He was different. He didn't need to fight. He knew that the right words, the right tone, the right kind of attention could be just as powerful as a weapon. Inside these walls, relationships weren't supposed to exist between officers and inmates. It wasn't just against the rules, it was dangerous. But at some point, something changed. The warden and the inmate. Two people on opposite sides of the system. And yet, something drew them together. No one noticed at first. Not the guards who worked alongside Angela every day. Not the inmates who were always watching for weaknesses. It wasn't an obvious mistake. It wasn't a public affair. But in a place where secrets don't stay hidden forever, it was only a matter of time before someone found out. And when the truth came out, the consequences were irreversible. By the time investigators uncovered what had happened inside the prison, it was too late. The affair was no longer the scandal. The real story was far more disturbing. A brutal murder, 27 stab wounds, and a woman who went from enforcing the law to breaking it in the most violent way possible. What drove Angela Simmons to commit such a crime? Was it rage? Betrayal? Or was there something else, something deeper, that no one saw coming? The answers would unravel over time, and when they did, they would expose a side of the prison system no one wanted to talk about. But first, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment when control started to slip, when a line was crossed, and when a decision was made that changed everything. Because this wasn't just a murder. It was a story of trust, deception, and the ultimate price of betrayal. Angela Simmons didn't start her career in a position of power. She earned it. Born and raised in Houston, Texas, she grew up in a strict but supportive household. Her father was a former police officer, a man who believed in discipline and hard work. Her mother was a schoolteacher, someone who pushed her to succeed academically. There was no room for failure in their home. No excuses. She wasn't the loudest or the most popular, but she was determined. She graduated with a degree in criminal justice and quickly found work as a correctional officer in one of Texas's toughest prisons. The environment was brutal, violence between inmates, power struggles between officers, the constant tension that came with working in a place where the slightest misstep could mean life or death. But Angela thrived in that environment. She moved up the ranks, gaining a reputation as someone who didn't back down, someone who could handle herself, someone who demanded respect. By the time she reached her 40s, she had earned the title of warden at John B. Connolly Unit, a maximum security prison known for housing some of the state's most dangerous criminals. Angela wasn't married. She didn't have children. She had dedicated her life to the job. And while she had built a career that many admired, those who knew her best saw the cracks beneath the surface. The job had hardened her. It wasn't uncommon for correctional officers, especially those in leadership positions, to develop an emotional detachment. It was a survival mechanism. They saw things the public never had to think about. Assaults, stabbings, manipulation, deception. It was easy to lose trust in people. Angela had learned to keep her emotions locked away. But in doing so, she had also isolated herself. She had built a career out of control and authority, but outside of work, there was nothing. No real relationships. No deep connections. And that's where the danger started. Because in an environment where emotions had to be buried, all it took was one moment of weakness for the lines to blur. Darius Monroe's story was different. Warden, Dallas, Texas, he didn't grow up with structure and discipline. He grew up in survival mode. His mother struggled with addiction. His father was in and out of prison. By the time Darius was a teenager, he had already experienced more instability than most people face in a lifetime. School wasn't a priority. He spent more time in the streets than in a classroom. He learned quickly that in certain environments, power didn't come from education, it came from fear. And Darius knew how to make people fear him. His first arrest came at 16. A robbery gone wrong. He spent time in juvenile detention, but it didn't change him. If anything, it made him more calculated. He didn't want to be reckless. He wanted to be smart. By the time he was 22, he was serving time for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The details of the case were violent. A dispute that turned into an attack, leaving a man critically injured. Darius claimed it was self-defense, but the jury didn't buy it. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Most inmates either kept their heads down or joined gangs to survive. But Darius wasn't like most inmates. He had a gift. He knew how to read people. He could tell who was weak, who was strong, who could be manipulated, who needed to be avoided. He wasn't the biggest or the most physically intimidating, but he didn't need to be. He controlled people with words. Darius knew that in prison, information was power. He made connections, gained favors, built alliances. He understood that some of the most powerful people in the system weren't inmates, but guards, the very people who were supposed to be in control. And that's what made him dangerous. Because while other inmates used violence to get what they wanted, Darius used something much more subtle. Charm. Angela Simmons had seen inmates like Darius before. She had dealt with manipulators, liars, and men who thought they could outsmart the system. She wasn't naive. She knew that the most dangerous inmates weren't the ones who lashed out violently, but the ones who played the long game. At first, he was just another inmate. He didn't cause trouble. He wasn't overly aggressive. He followed orders. But unlike the others, he knew how to make himself stand out without making himself a target. He was respectful, but not overly submissive. He never openly challenged authority, but he also never seemed afraid of it. And Angela noticed. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't obvious. But over time, something shifted. A conversation that lasted a little too long. A moment where their eyes met, where words were spoken that weren't part of protocol. A slow build. Because the truth was, Angela Simmons had spent years proving she was in control. And yet, for the first time in a long time, someone was making her feel seen. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was something much more dangerous. But whatever it was, it didn't stop. And once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. At first, it was nothing. Just routine interactions. Angela Simmons was the warden. Darius Monroe was an inmate. Their roles were clear, their boundaries firmly set. She had worked in the prison system long enough to know that inmates often tried to charm their way into better treatment. She had seen it before: flattery, fake politeness, attempts to establish a connection. It never worked on her. She had built her reputation on being firm and untouchable. But this was different. Darius wasn't the kind to push too hard. He wasn't openly flirtatious or reckless. He was careful. He knew that if he wanted to get close to Angela, he had to be patient. He played the long game. It started with small things: polite greetings when she passed his unit, eye contact that lasted a second longer than necessary, casual remarks that made him seem different from the other inmates. Unlike the ones who shouted for attention or acted tough, Darius was calm, controlled, almost like he didn't belong there. He spoke in a way that made him sound thoughtful, as if prison hadn't hardened him. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry. He was just there. And Angela noticed. It was a slow shift. A conversation here and there, always within the boundaries of professionalism, at least at first. He would ask about things that weren't related to prison. Not directly, anyway. You ever feel like the walls start closing in, even when you're on the outside? He asked her one evening when she was making rounds. She could have ignored it. She should have. But she didn't. Doesn't matter how it feels, she replied. Life keeps going either way. That should have been the end of it. Just another inmate trying to make conversation. But something about the way he looked at her in that moment made her hesitate. He wasn't just making small talk. He was studying her, watching her reaction. And for the first time, she found herself thinking about that interaction later. Thinking about him. The next time she passed his unit, he didn't say much. Just a nod, a half smile. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt something stir in her. Something she hadn't felt in years. Attention. Darius didn't push. He let the moments build naturally, knowing that if he played his cards right, she would come to him. And she did. It started with more conversations. Late rounds when the prison was quieter, when there weren't as many eyes watching. Angela told herself it was harmless. She wasn't breaking any rules by talking to him. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't manipulative in the way most inmates were. He was just easy to talk to. And that was the problem. Because the more they talked, the more she started to let her guard down. One night, during a routine check, she lingered near his cell a little longer than usual. He leaned against the bars, watching her in that same way he always did, calm, unbothered. "You ever get tired?" he asked. She frowned. "Tired of what?" "Of keeping up the act. Like you always have to be in control." Her breath caught for just a second. He wasn't supposed to say things like that. He wasn't supposed to read her like that. She should have shut it down, walked away, reported him for overstepping. But instead, she stood there. Because the truth was, he wasn't wrong. The lines blurred after that. Conversations turned into confessions. She started looking for him when she made her rounds, started noticing the way his voice sounded in the quiet halls. He wasn't just an inmate anymore. He was something else. Someone who understood something about her that no one else did. The first physical contact happened one night when she walked past his cell, and he reached out, just lightly, his fingers barely brushing against hers. She could have pulled away. She should have. But she didn't. That touch changed everything. It gave him permission to push further, to test the limits. And soon, it wasn't just words anymore. It was notes slipped into her office. Meetings in blind spots where cameras couldn't see. Her heart racing in ways it hadn't in years. It was reckless. Dangerous. But once she had crossed that line, she couldn't stop. And neither could he. Felt normal. Her job had always been draining. The long hours, the stress, the constant need to stay sharp, it all took a toll. The headaches weren't alarming at first. Neither was the slight fever that would come and go. But then, there were other things. Unexplained weight loss. Night sweats. A fatigue that felt different. Deep. Persistent. A kind of tiredness that sleep never fixed. She told herself it was just stress. Maybe she wasn't eating right. Maybe it was just the pressure of keeping up with everything. But the symptoms didn't go away. They lingered, creeping into her daily life, making her feel off. It wasn't until she started getting sores in her mouth that she admitted something was wrong. She made an appointment at a clinic. Nothing major, just a routine checkup, something to ease her mind. The nurse asked her standard questions, took her blood, and told her they would call when the results were ready. She left the clinic feeling numb, already dreading whatever they might find. Days passed. She went to work, kept up appearances, but something inside her was unraveling. Every time she passed Darius, she felt uneasy. Not because of guilt. She had buried that a long time ago. It was something else. A feeling she couldn't name. Then the call came. She was sitting at her desk when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer, but something told her she needed to. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. That was the first bad sign. "Ms. Simmons, we have your test results," the nurse said. Angela felt her stomach tighten. "There's something we need to discuss in person." Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew what that meant. They wouldn't call her in if it was nothing. She left work early and drove to the clinic, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced with possibilities, but she already knew. She could feel it. The nurse led her into a small room, sterile and impersonal. A doctor sat across from her, looking at her with an expression that made her want to run. "Miss Simmons," he said carefully, "your tests came back positive for HIV." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, everything blurred. She had to replay the words in her head to make sense of them. Positive. HIV. She shook her head. That can't be right. But the doctor didn't waver. "We ran the test twice to confirm. I know this is difficult to hear, but we need to talk about the next steps. Treatment, lifestyle adjustments." His voice faded into the background. The walls felt like they were closing in. The air was too thick. The room was too small. Her entire body felt like it was shutting down. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. The doctor kept talking, but she wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together the only thing that mattered. How had this happened? And then it hit her. Darius. She felt sick. Her entire body went cold. She had been careful. She had never been reckless. But she hadn't questioned him, hadn't thought to ask. She had trusted him in a way that she never should have. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the chair. "How long?" she whispered. "How long have I had it?" The doctor hesitated. "It's difficult to say exactly, but based on your symptoms, it's likely been several months." Months. Her chest felt tight. Her vision blurred. Her affair with Darius had been going on for almost a year. There was no other possibility. She barely remembered leaving the clinic. She got in her car and sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. Anger boiled inside her, but beneath it, there was something worse. Something that made her feel hollow. Betrayal. She had let him in. She had let him see parts of her that no one else did. And he had known. He had known all along. And he had said nothing. Angela couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't control. Her body felt heavy, her chest tight, her breathing shallow. She had replayed the clinic visit over and over in her head, hearing the doctor's voice like an echo she couldn't escape. HIV. The word alone made her stomach turn. It wasn't just the diagnosis, it was what it meant. Her life had changed in a way she couldn't fix. She had spent years building herself into someone strong, someone respected, someone in control. And now, she felt powerless. But beneath the shock, the fear, and the disbelief, there was anger. A slow, burning rage that wouldn't go away. Darius had done this to her. She had given him trust. She had let her guard down in a way she never had before. And he had taken that trust and destroyed her with it. He had known. There was no doubt in her mind. He had known exactly what he was carrying, and he hadn't cared. He had looked her in the eyes, touched her, whispered to her, and never once warned her. By the next morning, she had made up her mind. She had to confront him. She needed answers. At work, she kept up appearances. She moved through the motions, did her job, kept her voice steady. No one could tell anything was wrong. But inside, she was unraveling. Every time she saw Darius, a cold fury settled in her stomach. He was the same as always, calm, confident, acting as if nothing had changed. She waited until the right moment, until she was sure they wouldn't be overheard. Then, she called him into a back hallway, where the cameras didn't reach. Darius leaned against the wall, smirking like he always did. "What's up, Warden? You miss me." The sound of his voice made her skin crawl. She didn't waste time. "Did you know?" His smirk faltered. "Know what?" Her hands clenched into fists. "Don't play dumb with me, Darius." Her voice was low, shaking with barely contained fury. "Did you know you had HIV?" For a split second, something flashed in his eyes. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He shrugged. "That's a hell of an accusation." Her heart pounded. "Did you know?" she repeated, her voice sharper now. Darius let out a slow breath, rolling his tongue over his teeth. "And what if I did?" The world tilted. The hallway felt smaller, tighter. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "You did," she whispered. "You knew." He pushed off the wall and stepped closer. "Look, Angela. Things happen. Life ain't fair. You knew what you were getting into." Her stomach churned. "I didn't agree to this," she snapped. "I didn't agree to you ruining my life." Darius tilted his head. "And what are you going to do about it?" The smirk was back. That same smirk he always had. Like he was untouchable. Like nothing could ever touch him. Something inside her snapped. She stormed off, her hands shaking, her pulse racing. She needed to breathe, to think, to calm down. But she couldn't. The anger didn't fade. If anything, it grew. For days, she tried to suppress it. She tried to tell herself that it wasn't worth it, that she had already lost enough. But the more she thought about it, the more the rage festered. She had given him everything, trust, loyalty, a part of herself no one else had ever had. And in return, he had sentenced her to a lifetime of pain. She couldn't let him get away with it. She began planning. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. The thoughts came in pieces, how she could get him alone, how she could make sure no one saw, how she could make sure he never hurt anyone again. Then, one night, she stopped thinking. And she acted. The prison was quieter at night. Most of the inmates were locked down, the halls empty except for a few guards on patrol. She knew the routine. She knew where the blind spots were. She found him in his cell. He was lying on his cot, half asleep. She didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, the knife in her hand driving down before he even had time to react. The first stab was quick, deep, a shock to them both. Darius gasped, his body jerking upward, eyes wide in disbelief. Blood spread across his shirt. Then she did it again. And again. 27 times. By the time she stopped, her breath was ragged, her hands covered in blood. Darius lay motionless, his eyes staring up at nothing. The cell was silent. She felt no regret, no guilt. For the first time in weeks, she felt free. The prison was never truly silent, but that night, something felt different. The usual distant chatter of guards, the occasional clanking of metal doors, and the murmurs of inmates settling into restless sleep were overshadowed by a single, eerie stillness. It wasn't until the routine morning rounds that someone noticed the blood. A correctional officer stopped outside Darius' cell, squinting through the bars. At first, nothing seemed out of place. But then, there was the smell, metallic, thick, unmistakable. And then the sight, his motionless body on the cot, a dark red pool spreading across the floor. The officer called for backup. Within minutes, the prison was in lockdown. Sirens blared. Inmates were confined to their cells. Officers rushed in, their boots echoing through the halls as they surrounded the scene. The warden was dead. And the killer? One of their own. Angela had returned to her duties as if nothing had happened. She had cleaned herself up, changed into a fresh uniform, and resumed her routine. If anyone noticed anything strange about her that morning, they didn't say. She kept her face neutral, her movements measured. But when the radio call came in, she felt it in her chest. A sudden, sharp weight pressing down. She knew what they had found. Inside the cell, the officers assessed the damage. Darius' body was covered in stab wounds, each deep, deliberate. 27 in total. There was no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds on his hands, no overturned furniture. Whoever had done this had taken him by surprise. Angela stayed back at first, watching the investigation unfold. She heard the questions being asked, saw the way the officers were moving, piecing things together. But it wasn't until the prison director arrived that things shifted. The director was a woman who had spent years in the system, someone who knew every officer by name, every inmate's history, and could sense when something wasn't right. She stood over the body, arms crossed, her eyes scanning the cell with precision. This wasn't a fight, she said finally. This was personal. The officers nodded in agreement. They had all seen stabbings before, gang fights, acts of desperation, revenge attacks. But this was different. This wasn't about survival. It was about rage. They started questioning inmates. Nobody wanted to talk. Some claimed they hadn't heard anything. Others said they had been asleep. The few who admitted hearing something only described faint sounds, nothing unusual for a prison at night. But then, the medical examiner arrived. And with him, the timeline. Darius had been killed hours before the body was found. That meant only one thing. The killer had time to walk away, undetected. That's when suspicion turned inward. The investigation shifted from the inmates to the staff. Every officer on duty that night was questioned. Angela sat through her interview with a calm face, answering each question carefully, keeping her voice steady. Did you see anything unusual last night? No. Did you hear anything that stood out? Not that I remember. Where were you between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m.? In my office, reviewing reports. Then I did a final round before heading home. The officers nodded, jotting down notes, moving on to the next person. For a moment, it seemed like she might slip through. But then came the forensics report. Darius' wounds were too precise, too methodical. Whoever had done this had known exactly where to stab. It wasn't a random attack. It was controlled, calculated. And then, there was the key detail. Darius' cell showed no signs of forced entry. That meant only one thing. Someone with clearance had let themselves in. Angela still might have avoided suspicion if it weren't for one mistake. The prison had a security log, an automatic system that recorded every door opened and closed throughout the facility. When investigators checked the records, they found an entry. At 11:43 p.m., the lock to Darius' cell had been disengaged by Angela's ID. The moment the evidence was presented, the room went silent. She could see it in their faces, the way they exchanged glances, the realization settling in. Angela, The director said finally, her voice slow, careful. Is there something you want to tell us? Angela held her breath. The walls of the prison, the very place where she had once been in control, now felt like they were closing in on her. She could lie. She could try to explain it away. Say she had gone in to check on him. Say she had forgotten. But it wouldn't matter. They already knew. When the officers moved in, she didn't resist. She didn't say a word as they took her badge, as they placed her in handcuffs. The cold metal bit into her wrists, but she barely felt it. As she was led through the halls, past the same officers she had once worked beside, past the same inmates she had once overseen, whispers followed her. And for the first time, she was on the other side of the bars. The courtroom was packed. Rows of journalists, legal experts, and everyday people who had followed the shocking case filled the seats. The trial of Angela Williams was not just another criminal proceeding. It was a scandal that had rocked the prison system to its core. A respected prison warden, once tasked with maintaining order and discipline, now stood accused of brutally murdering an inmate she had been secretly involved with. The details were shocking, and the public couldn't look away. Angela sat at the defendant's table, wearing a beige prison jumpsuit. The authority she once had was gone. Instead of giving orders, she was now the one being watched, judged, and scrutinized. Her face was blank, but her eyes held something deeper. Whether it was regret, anger, or numbness, no one could tell. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They began with the affair, painting a picture of a woman who had crossed every professional boundary imaginable. They detailed how Angela had developed a secret relationship with Darius Taylor, how she had abused her position to meet with him privately, and how, over time, their affair had taken a dark turn. Then came the revelation that changed everything the moment Angela discovered she had contracted HIV. The prosecution argued that this was the breaking point, that she felt betrayed, humiliated, and enraged. Instead of walking away, she had let her emotions consume her, leading to a violent, premeditated attack. The evidence was overwhelming. The security logs showed her entering Darius' cell at 11:43 p.m. and leaving 15 minutes later. The forensic report confirmed that Darius had been stabbed 27 times, each wound precise and deliberate. The prosecution called medical experts to the stand, who testified that the number and location of the stab wounds suggested a deep, personal rage. They played recordings of Angela's police interview, pointing out inconsistencies in her statements. She had initially claimed she wasn't near Darius' cell that night, yet the digital records told a different story. When asked why her ID was used to access his cell, she had no explanation. Then, the prosecution presented what they called the most damning piece of evidence, the murder weapon. A standard-issue prison shank, found hidden in a supply closet, wiped clean of fingerprints but still carrying traces of Darius' blood. The closet was in an area restricted to prison staff, making it unlikely that any inmate could have placed it there. Angela's defense attorney tried to counter these claims. They argued that while Angela had made mistakes, she was not a murderer. They claimed that her relationship with Darius had been complicated, that she had been emotionally manipulated, and that she had panicked when she learned of her diagnosis. They suggested that maybe she had gone to confront him, that maybe things had gotten out of hand, but that this was not premeditated murder. They also attempted to cast doubt on the evidence. The security logs showed that Angela entered Darius' cell, but they didn't prove she killed him. No one had witnessed the attack. No blood was found on her uniform or belongings. They tried to argue that another officer, or even another inmate, could have framed her. But the prosecution had one final move, the testimony of her former colleagues. Several prison officers took the stand, describing Angela's behavior leading up to the murder. One officer testified that Angela had been acting distant and agitated in the weeks before the attack. Another mentioned overhearing a heated conversation between her and Darius days before his death. Then came the most damaging witness of all, a fellow prison officer who claimed that, on the night of the murder, Angela had been seen washing her hands repeatedly in the staff restroom, her face pale and shaken. The jury listened closely. They had been presented with a choice. Was this a crime of passion, an impulsive act driven by betrayal and emotion? Or was it something much colder, much more deliberate? After 2 weeks of testimony, arguments, and evidence, the case was handed to the jury. The deliberations lasted just under 8 hours. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. Angela sat motionless as the foreperson stood to read the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. A heavy stillness filled the courtroom. Angela didn't flinch. No visible reaction. No tears. No protests. Just silence. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience, wasted little time in delivering the sentence. Angela Williams, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps echoed through the room. The once respected prison warden, now convicted of the brutal murder of an inmate, would spend the rest of her days behind bars. As she was led away, shackles clinking with every step, the reality of her situation seemed to settle in. The same system she once controlled had now consumed her. The same walls she had once patrolled were now her prison. Angela Williams was no longer a respected prison warden. She was now inmate, confined within the same kind of prison where she once held authority. The weight of her life sentence set in as she was processed through the system, stripped of her title, her power, and her freedom. The same rules she once enforced now applied to her. The guards she used to work with no longer saw her as a colleague. She was just another prisoner. Her first few months behind bars were harsh. Many inmates knew who she was. Some had been under her supervision in the past, and they held grudges. Others saw her as a traitor to the system, someone who had crossed professional lines and lost everything because of it. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Some inmates kept their distance, while others made sure to remind her of the crime that brought her there. But prison life was not the only consequence Angela faced. Outside the walls, her name was now infamous. The media covered every detail of her trial, dissecting the affair, the HIV diagnosis, and the brutal murder of Darius Taylor. She became the subject of debates on ethics, abuse of power, and the consequences of forbidden relationships within the prison system. Every headline dragged her name further into disgrace. Her family, once proud of her accomplishments, struggled to come to terms with what she had done. Some of them refused to speak to her. Others tried to offer support from a distance, but the damage was done. Her career was gone. Her reputation was destroyed. The life she had built over decades had collapsed in an instant. Meanwhile, Darius Taylor's family was left grieving. His mother, who had spent years visiting him in prison, now had to bury her son. She spoke out publicly, demanding justice beyond just Angela's conviction. She questioned how such a relationship had even been allowed to happen. How had a prison warden been able to carry on an affair with an inmate without anyone noticing? Who else had failed in their responsibilities? The prison itself was thrown into chaos in the aftermath of the murder. The administration came under intense scrutiny. Investigators combed through security footage, staff records, and past incidents to determine if this was an isolated case or part of a larger pattern of misconduct. Several officers were disciplined or dismissed for negligence. The warden who had replaced Angela ordered stricter monitoring of staff-inmate interactions. New policies were introduced, aimed at preventing inappropriate relationships between prison staff and inmates. The case also sparked legal debates. Some argued that Angela should have been given a lesser sentence, claiming that her actions were driven by emotional distress and betrayal rather than cold-blooded intent. Others insisted that she had used her authority to manipulate the situation from the very beginning and that her punishment was deserved. Beyond the courtroom and the prison system, the story became a warning. Training programs for correctional officers began using Angela's case as an example of what happens when professional boundaries are broken. Seminars were held about power dynamics, ethical responsibilities, and the dangers of personal involvement with inmates. Angela, however, had no control over any of this. She spent her days in a small cell, reflecting on the choices that had led her there. She no longer had the authority she once wielded. She was no longer the one giving orders. Instead, she followed the same strict schedule as every other inmate: wake up, eat, work, sleep, repeat. With time, the media moved on to other stories, but the impact of her actions remained. Darius Taylor was gone. His family was left with unanswered questions and pain that would never fully heal. The prison system had been forced to confront its failures. And Angela Williams, once a powerful figure, was now living out a reality she never imagined, behind the very bars she once controlled. The story of Angela Williams and Darius Taylor is a chilling reminder of how a single decision can set off a chain of irreversible consequences. A respected prison warden, a man serving time, a forbidden relationship, and a crime of passion, each element played a role in a tragic ending that could have been avoided. Angela had once stood as a symbol of authority and discipline within the prison system. But when personal desires overpowered professional judgment, everything fell apart. What started as a secret affair led to deception, betrayal, and ultimately, a brutal murder. The moment she made the decision to cross the line with Darius Taylor, the course of her life was changed forever. Darius, too, played a role in the events that unfolded. His choices, his past, and his involvement in the affair all contributed to the escalating tension. But in the end, it was he who paid the ultimate price. 27 stab wounds ended his life inside the very walls that were meant to confine him, not kill him. His mother buried a son she had hoped to see free one day, and his death left wounds that would never heal. The justice system did its part, ensuring Angela was held accountable. But her story doesn't just end with a prison sentence. It serves as a warning about the dangers of crossing ethical boundaries, about the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions, and about the high cost of betrayal. This case also raises larger questions. How do we prevent abuse of power in institutions like prisons? What safeguards should be in place to ensure that those in authority do not exploit their positions? How can we protect both inmates and staff from situations that can lead to tragedy? As you followed this case, we encourage you to reflect on these questions. What are your thoughts on what happened? Was justice served, or do you think the punishment was too harsh or not harsh enough? Share your opinions in the comments below. If you found this case compelling, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update on the most shocking and thought-provoking cases. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and stay safe.